All right, so you guys asked for it, and we're delivering a deep dive into some of history and pop culture's biggest bastards.
Yeah.
And wow, you guys really delivered on this challenge. This is going to be fun.
Oh, yeah.
We're using excerpts from the Behind the Bastards podcast, and we're about to unravel the truth behind figures like Peter Thiel, Robert E. Lee, Steve Jobs, and T.B. Joshua.
Oh, gonna be good.
Get ready to have some assumptions challenged here.
It's going to be fascinating exploring these complex figures. And what's really intriguing to me is that a lot of these guys achieved great things,
Right.
but also left just a trail of destruction.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, can you separate the good from the bad,
Absolutely. That's what we're here to discuss.
Yeah.
It's not about labeling these guys heroes or villains, but rather understanding the nuances of their actions and their impact on the world.
Yeah, their impact on the world and the people around them.
For sure.
That's huge.
So let's start with Peter Thiel, the tech mogul,
Okay.
who co-founded PayPal and was an early investor in Facebook.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. This guy is seemingly obsessed with life extension.
Really?
We're talking HGH use and millions of dollars poured into anti-aging research.
Wow.
What's driving this? Is it pure vanity, a genuine fear of death, or something else entirely?
Well, it's definitely more than just a billionaire's whim.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how this ties into Thiel's broader worldview and his political activities.
Interesting.
Like, he's a major donor to Republican candidates, especially those with, like, a tech-focused or libertarian bent, like J.D. Vance, Blake Masters.
Right. I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like...
So it's not just random. There's like a through line there.
There's a definite through line there.
With his political donation.
Exactly. And his political journey is a bit of a roller coaster, too.
Oh, how's...
He was like a vocal supporter of Trump initially.
Okay.
Then he seemed to kind of distance himself. And now he's back to heavily investing in political campaigns.
What do you make of that shift?
It's, well, it's definitely intriguing. And it seems to reflect Thiel's evolving views on the role of technology in government.
Okay.
He's expressed frustration with what he sees as like the slow pace of innovation within traditional political systems.
Right. They don't move fast enough for him.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And this connects to his interest in seasteading.
Seasteading?
Yeah.
What is that?
Which, for those who aren't familiar, is the concept of creating independent, floating cities beyond the reach of existing governments.
It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi novel.
I know, right?
But it's actually gaining traction among some tech circles.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Interesting, okay.
Yeah, and then there's like the whole network state concept, which seems to be a more grounded version of this idea.
Okay.
Thiel's close relationship with Balaji Srinivasan, a prominent figure in the network state movement, is key here. Srinivasan, in his book, The Network State, argues that technology allows for the creation of new forms of governance.
Like what?
Essentially like online communities that can evolve into physical territories.
Oh, so instead of traditional nation states, we could see the rise of these tech-driven communities.
Exactly.
With their own rules and systems.
It's a pretty radical idea, and I'm curious,
Yeah.
what do you think the implications for democracy and individual rights are?
I don't know.
It's interesting to think about.
For sure. But before we dive too deep into the future,
Right.
let's shift gears to a figure from the past.
Okay.
Robert E. Lee, the legendary Confederate general.
Oh, yeah.
He's often portrayed as like a tragic hero forced into a difficult decision.
And I've heard that, yeah.
But our sources suggest a more complicated picture, starting with his family's deep ties to Virginia aristocracy and, importantly, slave ownership.
That's crucial context because it challenges the romanticized view of Lee as like a reluctant warrior.
Right.
He wasn't just fighting for his home state.
Yeah.
He was fighting to maintain a system that benefited him and his class.
Right.
His own family owned slaves, and he personally benefited from that system.
It makes you question his motivations for joining the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And even his military genius, which is often lauded, seems debatable. While he achieved tactical victories, his overall strategic vision for the Confederacy was, well, short-sighted.
Interesting.
There's this quote about Lee wanting to drive the armies of the enemy from the field in order to achieve peace, which highlights a lack of foresight.
That's a really good point.
If we connect this quote to the bigger picture, it seems Lee focused on battlefield victories without a clear plan for winning a war
Right.
against a more industrialized opponent, ultimately contributing to the Confederacy's defeat.
Like the Battle of Gettysburg, for example, was
Yeah.
a major turning point in the war, and it was the disaster for the Confederacy.
And then there's the issue of Lee's treatment of slaves, which is often glossed over.
Right.
The sources we have paint a pretty grim picture. There's documented evidence of him ordering whippings
Oh, wow.
for runaway slaves who were captured and returned.
That's intense.
It challenges this image of Lee as like a benevolent figure.
Right, and even within his own family, there were starkly different views on secession.
Really?
His own sister, for instance, remained a staunch Union supporter throughout the war.
Wow.
So the idea that he was simply torn between loyalty to his state and his nation falls apart when you look at the actions of those closest to him.
Yeah.
It really makes you question what was truly driving his decisions.
Okay, so we've got Peter Thiel pushing the boundaries of technology and governance, and Robert E. Lee tangled up in the complexities of the Civil War and slavery.
Right.
Let's move on to another figure who straddles the line between innovation and controversy.
Okay, who's that?
Steve Jobs.
Oh, yeah.
He's the iconic visionary behind Apple, the marketing genius who revolutionized the way we interact with technology.
Mm-hmm.
But as always, there's a darker side to the story.
Yeah, I think.
Our sources point to some interesting early influences on Jobs, particularly his mentor, Robert Friedland, who is known for his manipulative tactics and, shall we say, flexible relationship with the truth.
That's fascinating how these early experiences shaped Jobs' worldview and his approach to business.
Yeah.
Friedland's influence is evident in Jobs' own manipulative tendencies, which are well documented.
Yeah. And that's definitely reflected in his personal life, too, especially his relationship with his daughter, Lisa.
What happened?
He initially denied paternity, putting Lisa and her mother through a lot of pain and uncertainty.
Really?
It took years for him to acknowledge Lisa, and even then, their relationship was fraught with tension.
That's really heartbreaking, and it highlights a pattern of behavior that seems to have followed Jobs throughout his career.
Right.
He was notoriously difficult to work with,
I've heard that.
often taking credit for the ideas of others and pushing his employees to their limits.
Which is interesting because he was also deeply into Eastern spirituality and mindfulness.
Really?
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
This guy who could be incredibly ruthless and demanding, yet also claimed to be seeking enlightenment.
It certainly raises questions about how much of his spirituality was genuine versus a carefully constructed persona.
Yeah.
Was it a genuine attempt at self-improvement, or was it another tool for manipulation and control?
It's almost like he was compartmentalizing different aspects of his life.
Right.
The Zen master on one hand and the cutthroat businessman on the other.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if he could ever truly reconcile those two sides of himself.
That's fascinating, and it brings up a broader point about how we judge these complex figures.
Right.
Can we separate their achievements from their negative actions? Can we admire the genius behind the iPhone while acknowledging the human cost of its creation?
That's a tough one. It's like trying to untangle a knot.
It really is.
And speaking of tangled webs, our final figure for this deep dive takes us into the world of charismatic religious leaders.
Okay.
T.B. Joshua, a Nigerian pastor known for his televised healing miracles,
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
built a massive following based on claims of divine intervention. But was it all just smoke and mirrors?
The sources we have suggest a deliberate manipulation of both imagery and audience.
Really?
Joshua's healings were often theatrical events, carefully staged and edited for maximum impact.
Wow.
He seemed to specifically target Western audiences, using white missionaries to distribute videos of his supposed miracles.
It was a savvy marketing strategy that played on people's desire for the extraordinary.
For sure.
One example that really stands out is the healing of a man with a severe skin disease.
Oh, yeah, I think I've seen that.
The video shows Joshua commanding the disease to leave the man's body, and then the man vomits up this white, foamy substance.
Ugh.
It's presented as a divine miracle, but you can't help but notice the staged elements
Right,
and the questionable methods at play.
right. And while faith and belief are personal matters,
Of course.
there's a clear ethical line when it comes to exploiting vulnerable people for profit. Joshua's rhetoric also included harmful views on homosexuality, linking it to bad luck and misfortune, further marginalizing an already vulnerable community in Nigeria.
It's a reminder that charisma and spiritual authority can be used for good or for ill.
Absolutely.
And it raises the question, how do we discern genuine spiritual leaders from those who are simply skilled manipulators?
That's a complex question without easy answers, but I think a healthy dose of skepticism and critical thinking can go a long way.
For sure.
It's important to look beyond the spectacle
Mm,
and examine the evidence, the motives, and the potential consequences of these individuals' actions.
absolutely. It's disturbing to think about the harm that can be inflicted under the guise of religion.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that the Nigerian government eventually stepped in and banned the broadcast of video miracles,
Really?
citing concerns about fraudulent practices. Did that stop Joshua's ministry?
Not completely. He was a very adaptable figure.
Right.
The ban was primarily aimed at the distribution of videos,
Right.
not the healings themselves. Okay. Joshua found ways to continue spreading his message through other channels.
I see.
It speaks to his entrepreneurial spirit, even if that spirit was ultimately serving questionable ends.
You have to wonder about the power of spectacle and the role of belief in all of this.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
People are drawn to the extraordinary, and Joshua was a master at creating that sense of awe and wonder, even if it meant blurring the lines between faith and deception.
Absolutely. And this desire for the extraordinary can be seen in other areas as well,
Like where?
like with Peter Thiel and the network state movement.
Yeah. Oh, so.
Is it a genuine attempt to create a better future? Or is it another form of elitism where the wealthy and technologically savvy seek to separate themselves from the rest of society?
I'm really curious about your take on this whole network state idea.
Yeah.
On the one hand, I can see how technology could be used to create more efficient and equitable systems of governance.
Right.
But on the other hand, I'm wary of concentrating power in the hands of a select few.
I think that's a valid concern. Thiel and his supporters argue that traditional nation-states are failing to keep up with the challenges of the 21st century.
Oh.
They believe that technology offers a path to a more innovative and responsive form of governance.
But couldn't that lead to a situation where the rights and freedoms of ordinary citizens are trampled on?
Potentially.
What happens to democratic principles and accountability in a system ruled by algorithms and tech elites?
That's the key question.
Yeah.
And it's why it's so crucial to examine the motivations and potential consequences of these movements.
Okay.
We need to ask ourselves who benefits from these new systems and who is left behind.
It seemed like a lot of these bastards we're discussing have something in common.
What's that?
A desire to disrupt the status quo, whether it's in the realm of technology, politics, or religion.
That's a great observation.
But that disruption can often come at a cost.
It's important to distinguish between disruption that's driven by genuine progress and disruption that's fueled by ego, greed, or a thirst for power.
Think about Steve Jobs. He was a master of disruption.
He was.
He revolutionized the tech industry multiple times over, but he also had a reputation for being ruthless, manipulative, and even cruel at times.
And that's the challenge with figures like Jobs.
Right.
They can inspire and innovate, but they can also inflict harm.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that progress is rarely a neat and tidy process.
Right.
It's often messy and fraught with unintended consequences.
Which brings us back to the importance of critical thinking and informed skepticism.
Oh, absolutely.
We can't just blindly celebrate those who claim to be disruptors or visionaries.
Right.
We need to look beyond the hype and examine their motives, methods, and the potential downsides of their actions.
We need to be discerning consumers of information.
Yeah.
We can't just accept things at face value.
Right.
We have to question the narratives we're presented with and seek out multiple perspectives.
Because the truth is often far more complex and nuanced than we might initially think.
It is.
And that's especially true when it comes to history. We've seen how the narrative surrounding Robert E. Lee has evolved over time, from a defender of slavery to a symbol of Southern heritage and military prowess.
It's a fascinating example of how historical figures can be recast to fit the needs of the present.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of understanding the context in which these figures operate.
For sure.
We can't judge them solely by our modern-day values.
Right. We have to try to see the world through their eyes, even if we ultimately disagree with their choices.
Exactly.
It's about understanding, not necessarily condoning.
And that's why it's so important to engage with history, even when it's uncomfortable or challenging.
Yeah.
It's about learning from the past so that we can make more informed and ethical choices in the present.
Speaking of ethical choices, let's circle back to Steve Jobs for a moment.
Okay.
He famously said, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do."
It's a powerful quote, but it also raises some important questions.
Like what?
What happens when that desire to change the world is combined with a lack of ethical boundaries? Can innovation and compassion coexist?
It seems like Jobs often struggled with that balance.
Yeah.
He was driven by a relentless pursuit of perfection, but that drive often came at the expense of those around him.
And this tension between innovation and ethics is becoming increasingly relevant in the age of artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
AI has the potential to transform countless aspects of our lives.
Right.
But it also poses significant risks if it's not developed and deployed responsibly.
It's like we're standing at a crossroads.
It really is.
AI could lead to incredible advancements in medicine, education, and countless other fields, but it could also be used to create autonomous weapons systems, manipulate people's thoughts and behaviors,
Right.
or exacerbate existing inequalities.
Exactly. And that's why we need to be having these conversations now.
Yeah.
We need to establish ethical frameworks and safeguards before these technologies become so powerful that they're beyond our control.
We need to think about the long-term consequences of the technologies we're creating, not just the immediate benefits.
For sure.
It's about being proactive, not reactive.
It's about recognizing that technology is not neutral. It reflects the values and biases of those who create it.
And if we're not careful, those biases can be amplified and embedded in the very systems that shape our lives.
Yeah.
It's a sobering thought, but also an empowering one,
Yeah.
because we have the power to choose the kind of future we want to create.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the concept of the Red Queen hypothesis, which we touched on earlier.
Oh, yeah. Right.
It's the idea that we need to constantly evolve and adapt just to stay in place.
So in the context of technology, this means we need to be constantly developing safeguards and ethical frameworks to prevent unintended consequences.
Exactly.
You can't afford to be complacent.
We need to be willing to challenge the status quo, to ask tough questions, and to hold those in power accountable because the stakes are incredibly high.
The future is not predetermined. It's something we create through our choices and actions. And if we want to create a future that's just, equitable, and sustainable, we need to be mindful of the technologies we develop and how we use them.
We need to think critically, engage in open and honest dialogue, and work together to ensure that technology serves humanity rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
It's a daunting task, but also an incredibly exciting one.
It feels like we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. I'm honestly a little overwhelmed.
I know, right? It's a lot.
But in a good way. It's incredible how these seemingly disparate figures, Peter Thiel, Robert E. Lee, Steve Jobs, and T.B. Joshua, all connect to these larger themes of power, innovation, and the complexities of human nature.
It's true, isn't it? They each represent different facets of these themes.
Yeah.
And it makes you realize that these aren't just abstract concepts.
Right.
They're playing out in the real world,
Yeah.
shaping our lives in profound ways.
Exactly. It's not just history.
Right.
It's about understanding the forces that are shaping our present and our future.
Right. And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping that future.
Yeah.
We're not just passive observers.
Right.
We're active participants. Our choices matter.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What can we learn from these bastards and their complicated legacies?
I think one of the most important lessons is that we can't just accept simple narratives or easy answers.
Yeah.
The world is messy and complicated.
It is.
And people are even more so.
Right.
We have to be willing to grapple with that complexity, to embrace nuance, and to question our assumptions.
It's about being critical thinkers, not just accepting what we're told.
Absolutely.
And it's about holding those in power accountable,
Yes.
whether it's in government, business, or even religion.
Absolutely. Power can be seductive, and it can easily be abused.
Right.
It's our responsibility to hold those who wield it to a high standard.
And I think another key takeaway is that we need to be mindful of the stories we tell ourselves about the past.
Oh, for sure.
We've seen how the narrative surrounding Robert E. Lee has been sanitized over time, obscuring the true horrors of slavery and the Confederacy's fight to preserve it.
It's a reminder that history is often written by the victors, and that those in power have a vested interest in shaping the narrative to suit their own purposes.
It's up to us to dig deeper, to challenge those dominant narratives, and to seek out the voices and perspectives that have been silenced or marginalized.
It's about recognizing that history is an ongoing conversation, not a fixed set of facts.
Right.
And we all have a role to play in shaping that conversation.
So to our listeners, as you go forward, remember that the stories of Peter Thiel, Robert E. Lee, Steve Jobs, and T.B. Joshua are not just historical curiosities. They are reflections of ourselves, our society, and the challenges we face as human beings.
They are invitations to think critically, to engage in meaningful dialogue, and to strive for a more just and equitable world.
And who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to do a deep dive of your own.
You never know.
After all, the best way to learn is to keep asking questions and keep exploring.
I completely agree.
Thanks for joining us on this wild ride.
Yeah, this was a fun one.
Until next time.